I call this meeting to order. This is a regular meeting of the Northfield Public School Board. Today is Monday, March 9th, 2015, and the time is 7 p.m. Dr. Richardson, there are a number of items in the table file.
Yes, in your table file tonight, you've got a information in terms of brief summary and responses on the transformational technology feedback sessions that were held over the course of the last month or so, and also a one-page or couple-page document in terms of the Master Facilities Plan review and update to give you some information specifically on some of the questions that you had at the last meeting, and then we'll also talk a little bit about some of the other pieces that we're still gathering data on that we'll be able to share with you a little later this spring. We also have a couple of items in terms of recommendations for employment on individuals as are listed in the table file. So I would recommend that those be placed on the agenda in the consent file. And then the other thing is we would like to add an item for information, which would be a closed negotiation strategy session that would immediately follow the April 13th, 2015 regular school board meeting. It's that time of the year and that time of the season again that we need to begin to get ready for that process again.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's no objection, we'll add these items to the agenda as we move forward. We now have an opportunity for public comment. This is a chance for members of the district to address the board. Is there anyone here who wishes to address the board? Okay. Appears there's no one here, so we will move on to approval of the minutes. Board members, you have in your packet minutes for the regular school board meeting held on February 23rd, 2015. Is there a motion to approve the minutes? Moved by Noel. Is there a second? Second by Jeff. Any questions or discussion? Okay. All those in favor of approving the minutes for the regular meeting held on Monday, February 23rd, 2015, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Those minutes are approved. Move on to announcements and recognitions. Dr. Richardson?
Okay, I have a full page this evening. So, first of all, for the 21st year, our Northfield German students participated in the National German Exam Competition. Competing this year were 40 students from levels 2, 3, 4, and 5. And again, this year, many of our Northfield students placed very well. The Bronze Award, which scores at or above the 70th percentile nationwide, were received by Liam Fisher, Megan Revels, and Cecilia Krista. The Silver Award, with scores at or above the 80th percentile nationwide, were received by Elizabeth Peterson, Bridget Forster, Andrea Turnhier. Thank you. Turnhier.
Andrea Turnhier.
Andrea Turnhier. Thanks so much. Martha Barth and Curtis Bobert. The Gold Award is given for scores above the 90th percentile and advances the students to the prize level competition. This involves writing a short essay in German and an oral interview, also conducted in German. Gold Award winning students this year include Nicholas Kidd, Mariah Casme, Laura Olson, Victoria Campbell, Christoph Zweifel, and Elizabeth Clarity. The interviews were conducted last Saturday at the University of Minnesota. Congratulations again to all the students who participated in the competition for a job well done. We also have several notes from the middle school band for 7th and 8th grade, from the band director and high school jazz band director, Ethan Fryer. First of all, congratulations to all of our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade band members on a fantastic concert on February the 10th. All that hard work by students, parents, and teachers really paid off. Congratulations to Linnea Larson for being chosen piano player for the Minnesota Band Directors Association's 6th through 8th grade jazz band. They performed at the Minnesota Music Educators State Conference on February the 13th. Also, congratulations to Linnea Larson, Jonathan Wise, and Anna Weber on being chosen to be members of the Minnesota Band Directors Association All-State Grade 6 through 8 Concert Band. Also, congratulations to Sam Ryden and Joe Crease for their upcoming participation in the Southeast Minnesota Band Directors Grades 7 through 10 Honor Jazz Bands. They will be rehearsing and playing on March the 7th in Farmington. The Southeast Minnesota Band Directors Association commissioned a piece from Ethan Fryer to be premiered at the concert. On February the 27th, the 8th grade band, directed by Mr. Fryer, attended a concert band festival in Woodbury. After their performance, they worked with the University of Minnesota professor, Dr. Tim Dia. And on February the 28th, the middle school band, directed by Mr. Fryer, attended a jazz festival at the University of Minnesota. Clinicians Phil Hay and Pete Whitman gave the band excellent feedback after the performance. So again, congratulations to our middle school band members and to meet them. We'd also like to recognize this past weekend, and we're going from orchestra and band to the state weightlifting meet in Lakeville. Northfield had 13 students qualify for state, and 11 of them medaled at the tournament, and 9 of the 11 were girls. Congratulations to the team and coaches Dan Myers and Laura Marks. Also on March 1st through 7th was National School Social Worker Week. And again, we appreciate all the work that school social workers do for our students and families. This week is National AmeriCorps Week. Thanks to all of our reading and math core staff in each of our buildings. They've really provided some quality extra assistance that our students need every day. We'd also like to thank the high school teachers and students for going to Bridgewater for Read Across America Day on March the 2nd. It was great to have the older students reading with elementary students. They are great role models. And finally, I'd like to congratulate our own Bridgewater principal, Nancy Antoni. She has been selected as the 2015-17 Minnesota Elementary School Principal Association's president-elect, which then follows with 2 years as president and 1 year as past president. So this is a 5-year gig. So again, congratulations, Nancy, on a great honor. And that's all the announcements I have this evening.
That's a lot of announcements. Is there anything anyone would like to add? Okay, so we will move on then to items for discussion in our reports, and we will begin with the report on feedback from the transformational technology listening sessions. And there was a sheet in your table file to facilitate discussion. So if board members want to search for that. And we'll begin, Dr. Richardson.
Sure. And Kim and Risky is here this evening, our Director of Technology, to talk to you about the update on and feedback from 10 sessions in terms of listening sessions with staff, 2 family listening sessions, and responses from families and staff in terms of survey data about transformational technology. And so she will be sharing with you information and a summary of kind of the things that we've learned about technology and how people are feeling after approximately the first 18 months into the process.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's hard to follow all that good news. I hope I can keep it up. It's a good mood to start with, at any rate. So, like Dr. Richardson said, this is feedback gathered from those listening sessions and from the surveys that were sent to all families as well as staff in each of our schools. And the surveys were quite similar to the surveys done last year, which Mr. Hillman conducted, and quite a variety of responses in those 60. So the information that I'm presenting tonight is really some themes that emerged in the feedback. It is not exhaustive of all of the things that we heard by any means, but like I say, the themes that emerged. And then I do add some response and some clarification throughout. And at this point, this is informational. It's not a recommendation of any sort. But moving forward, we will take this information to and actually it's been shared already with the District Tech Steering Committee, which includes representatives from each of our schools. Tomorrow we meet, and we meet again next Thursday, and that group will work to make recommendations for moving forward with transformational technology. So that said, like I said, the themes that emerged, the number one theme that we saw is concerns about distractibility, with the technology being one-to-one. Was the biggest challenge mentioned in the secondary, I should say, was where we heard most about that, in the one-to-one atmosphere. We had many requests to close the App Store. I'll get to that a little bit later. And some concerns about the loss of ability to focus, as students are dealing with too many demands and things that are grabbing their attention in front of them. There's a concern that they are losing the ability to stay on track and focus. And so part that I added in is that the passive technology use does, with research, increase distractibility, as does media playing in the background, which is typical of current research that's available from the American Academy of Pediatricians, for example. This is challenging on all platforms, so we've heard some conversation about the devices we use, which I'll also get to in a little bit, and the distractions are available in technology, and so moving forward, education is really our best resource in combating, I think, the distractibility. Screen time was another concern that was brought up, again, with some research from the American Academy of Pediatricians. And those recommendations, the most current ones that are published on their website are from 2010. They have a high focus on limiting technology for entertainment's sake. And there is some distinction there between technology that is active and passive. And in current research, that tends to emerge as well. So being mindful is where we're at right now when we think about screen time and the effects that we see with screen time. We don't really know all of the effects of mobile technology. This is pretty new to us. And so as we move forward, I would say that being aware, being cognizant of research as it comes out, and providing support for our families and for our students, at, both at school and at home, is a major focus for us. Responsible use was another topic that emerged. And this went a little bit more towards the positive and towards the problem-solving nature of what do we do with the distractibility, with the screen time concerns, and how do we provide the best education for our students and provide a technology-rich environment that prepares them for the future. And so we have seen repeated requests for the App Store to be closed, like I mentioned with the distractibility portion, and that is to the extent that we will certainly address that moving forward in 2015-16. We would see a very different approach than what we have this year with the open App Store, at least starting out. The appropriate use of the internet is also a concern. We do filter the internet, as we are required to by law, and it's a challenging and imperfect system. So there are times where something gets through that it shouldn't maybe get through, or it's not age appropriate, but it is the best system we have at this point for monitoring the internet. And part of what we need to do is provide resources for monitoring here at school, but also for monitoring at home. Again, education about responsible use and age-appropriate use of technology is our best resource in preparing our students to participate in our dynamic world. We've had some comments about achievement and some concerns about achievement, and this is a difficult one to track, a difficult one to point out what causes our students to achieve at certain levels. We've heard some comments about an increase in the percentage of F grades or failing grades last year, the 2013-14 school year. And then we've also, I think we've heard some concerns about particularly the 9th grade raised during the listening session. So I did do a little bit of a longitudinal look at the high school grade distribution. I'll share that just a little bit so you can see kind of how I looked through it. No, I looked at it twice. All right, so what I did, and I'm not going to go through all these numbers by any means, but so that you can see that I'm trying to take a look at really what we have for data. I worked with Hope Langston, looked at data from Viewpoint, and I looked by cohort of students. So if you look at the class of 2019, they're 8th graders right now. The reason I dropped down to the class of 2019 is because down here, I go through our last year's seniors. And so the class of 2014, and I looked at that class longitudinally down to their 8th grade year, and then I tracked each subsequent group down to their 8th grade year, and just looked at the distribution of total letter grades, so total numbers of A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's that students earned in those terms, each term. Now, it gets a little bit messy going to middle school because they don't have semesters, so I took the closest match I could find with quarter 4 and quarter 2 grades. And so just a couple of the trends, like I said, I'm not going to go through all of the numbers, but we did see an increase if you look at these columns here. That's the 2013-14 school year. And if you look at the bottom row in each group, you do see some of the highest, not always the highest, but some of the highest percentages of F grades. Now at the same time, we're looking at pretty small numbers as we look through essentially 1 to 2% of all grades given in those terms. And then, if you look at column C, you see semester 1 of the 2014-15 school year where we see essentially the lowest failure rates we've seen in any of the years I looked at. So that's a look by cohort of students, and that does track all students in these classes, so it includes high school and ALC, and the same group of students throughout each year. So it will only include those students who are active in all of those years. And then I took the same data, so these are the same numbers portrayed just a little bit differently, down below where you see grade 8 year to year. So this year's 8th graders, last year's 8th graders, 12 to 13 8th graders, and so on and so forth. Again, we see a slight increase in the failure rate here in the 2013 to 14 school year. Again, it's not always the highest rate. We do see some outlier terms where we had as high or higher failure rates. And then again, we see that overall, looking at semester 1 of this year, we have some of the lowest failure rates that we see in any of the terms. So that's the reason that I looked through this, is I just wanted to know. I looked at it and I thought, if these concerns are coming up, if we're concerned that our students are no longer achieving at the levels that they used to achieve at, we need to take a serious look at that. And so instead of having the couple of data points that were shared with me, I wanted to have a more widespread overview looking forward. So as stated with transformational technology, we didn't intend to measure it based on grades or based on standardized test scores. However, we don't want to ignore them. And so like I say, I wanted to look into those numbers to see what we can actually see. And so again, goal is to be mindful, being aware of the correlations. I'm not going to call them effects or what's causing our grades. I'm not fully certain. Too many variables to look at, but I do want to be mindful and aware as we move forward so that we're not ignoring data that is available to us. We have also heard some of the feedback from the English Language Learner Family Survey. I know some of you received that information in an email, and so initial reports that we had heard kind of generalized that we had struggles with our English language learner families. Once again, I wanted to look into that, so I did a bit of analysis of those individual responses, and what I saw is that they demonstrate some varied feedback. So this is hard to see. What I did is I took, the first column here is hidden because it includes all the names that were provided in that survey, the families. Some of them are anonymous. But I took each individual response and kind of went across, and I added columns as I saw items that they mentioned. And so trying my best to quantify some of that qualitative data and look at what they really said. And so the first 5 columns there demonstrate if they had a negative or a positive or a mix of positive and negative impression overall of technology based on the responses that were given. What I saw there was that we had one who was uncertain, or one who was, they never used it. The student worked, came home, went to sleep, never used the iPad. We had one that was uncertain if they were positive or negative. We had 2 that were all negative. We had 12 that mentioned positive and negative attributes. And we had 7 in those responses, there was 23 responses, that indicated all positive sentiments about transformational technology. So, like I say, I kind of parsed that out. If you go down the columns, you see things like fighting. We had heard fighting mentioned. There were 4 cases where they mentioned stress on the family or relationships. And that's something, a challenge we need to take seriously. There was some with parental monitoring. We heard some concern about parental monitoring. I think this was 9 that say that they had monitoring in place. Yeah, sorry, I can't do the whole screen. And then there were, I think 4 mentioned that they were unable to monitor because parents were not present all the time. That was 5 that say they were able to manage the demands and the focus and distractibility. Unable to monitor as well. Yep, 4. So in comparison, some of the numbers that we've heard about or the generalizations, I just wanted to take a deeper look and say what are the families really saying if we go response by response. In the category of teaching and professional development, this is, I would say, our biggest area for growth, our biggest area for transformation and change. And moving forward, I think the goal needs to be, how do we frame what's the next best practice? It doesn't need to be what we've always had in mind. It doesn't need to be in the same terms that we have always used. But looking ahead, what is going to be the biggest way to improve student learning? And this is not necessarily just a technology focus, but looking at high instructional impact, high student learning impact by instructional changes, and how the technology can support and accelerate those practices. So again, looking at reframing, technology integration, still looking at the SAMR model, but maybe also allowing some other interpretation of what's good technology integration. I was going to get blocked for a moment. This is John Hattie's research, the meta-analysis, and it demonstrates what are the biggest game changers for student learning based on instructional practices. And some of these top ones, student self-reporting grades, Piaget's theory applied, providing formative evaluation, micro-teaching, really evaluating our teaching practice. These are the ones that are big game changers for our students. And so if we want to look at using technology effectively for student learning, looking into the practices that providing very good feedback to our students might be a really good place to start. And looking at how we can gather that kind of data with our technology to guide our students in what the next best steps are for their learning. So we want to emphasize the high impact instructional practices and also emphasize confidence in our teachers. I have heard over and over again that some of our teachers feel judged based on how they use the iPads, which was never intended, not at all. And so looking ahead, I would hope for confidence in realizing the professionalism of our teachers. We have great teachers. That's clear in all of the conversations I've had. Teachers who care about our kids, teachers who know a great deal about pedagogy, and emphasizing their professional ability to make the best decision for their students, when to use technology, when to set it aside, and using it at the points where it's going to have the highest impact. And then the biggest one is focused on a cultivation of a culture of learning. The ability to have good conversations, the ability to dialogue, to challenge each other, to take risks, to question. Those will all contribute to best instructional practice. And then parents and family support. This was clear in our listening sessions with families. We had not a huge amount of participation, so 4 people were present at the first community meeting, and we had 8 parents present at the second. One of them was at both, so a total of 11 parents. And they still managed to span a range on their beliefs and their perspectives with the use of technology. So Anne's smiling, she was at both of those sessions. So on the one hand, where we had 4 members present, we had one parent who has almost no technology in their home. They purchased a television last year. And we had another parent who provides every sort of technology to their students and encourages open use. And so one who's saying we need to monitor and be very closed and maybe keep it at school, one who's saying give them everything you possibly can, this is the world they live in. So when I figure out how to balance that, I will let you know. But it's a task, I would say, at this point. And what came through loudest with all of the different responses we had is that we needed an increase in our engagement and our resources that we provide to parents. Educating parents about how to monitor, using tools that can monitor what is going on their student iPad, providing access to research for positive applications, as well as potential risks. Some of the parents recommended some hands-on tech training, so using the iPad to see what their students are actually doing and how the tools work. And then also, we heard that parents would really like school support for parental monitoring and rule setting at home. So stating with the students that this is not yours, that when you go home, your parents still can use this and still can define what is acceptable in your home. On the topic of elementary iPads, this is a very brief overview. The main thing is they want more iPads. We heard at each building an increase in the number of devices to allow for true innovation, that when they're using their pod of 6 iPads, the best that they can do is station work, and it's difficult to really change practices and allow for more than, say, a high-tech flash card use or a quizzing tool. They are getting some assessment data, some common assessment data, and that's, I would say, a high point of what is happening in elementary schools. And we have motivated teachers ready to try some new things with their students, and motivated students, I would say. Looking forward, we need to help our elementary schools and teachers manage classroom iPads to facilitate app distribution. It's not very feasible for elementary teachers dealing with multiple iPads to manage individually each one of those iPads. And supporting teachers with the logistics of management, things like charging and storage, security. We heard some concerns there about just how do we manage the devices. Not as much about what do we do with them, still some there, but how do we manage this? And I added on ongoing professional development because that was a theme in every school, that people want to look at what does modification look like, what does transformation look like, what kinds of tools are available, and how can we have ongoing professional development for our teachers to have a vision of what you might be able to do, and then support for walking it out in their classes. And so where I talked about professional development already, I think that applies at all levels. We had some conversations about device options, particularly at the high school, as well as at the middle school. And there were requests made for Chromebooks or laptops. And I would say we're looking into that. Mr. Hillman has promised to provide some device trials, so he's going to get some trial devices that teachers can look at and try and see what they can do. The main needs that people brought up when looking at different devices were keyboarding, flash, and minimizing distractions. So the keyboarding piece, looking at word processing, and that also, I would say, goes a little bit further into formatting and having an appropriate tool for things like MLA and APA formatting. Flash, we can actually provide on the iPad with an app that is a Flash-enabled browser. And then minimizing distractions tended to focus on the App Store, and that is something that we're looking to address as well moving forward. The concerns with looking at other devices included durability of a different device based on not having the Griffin Survivor case on it. So looking at a laptop type device with a hinge and what would happen with transporting something like that. Investments in learning and content creation thus far over the past 2 years, we have teachers who have worked very hard to adapt curriculum and to create materials for using with iPads. And then the flexibility of the device in terms of having a camera that's integrated, and also in terms of the touch screen. If you look at people like John Beatty, he said, or that came up at the middle school session, Amy was there, and somebody said, what about other devices? And we said, well, we can look at other devices, and John went, well, what about doing this and that? And everybody went, oh, you're right. You know, so there's been, I still see a need to have some sort of balanced options. I also see that the iPad is not intended to completely replace everything we did on a computer, but to provide access for each of our students to quite a few tools for creativity. We also heard loud and clear that nobody, parents or teachers, were looking to move away from technology access, but looking to manage it better. And then I just threw in a couple of examples of what some of the teachers recently have been doing. This was in Jody Saxton West's class. These are students studying biology, and they're looking at samples of an algae that they received from some scientists that they actually collaborated with on FaceTime. And they have groups of students working together. They're looking up information for real-world application of what this algae could do. And they're looking to see what they can find in the microscope and see some properties of this. And then they're documenting by taking pictures through the microscope. So the images are actually pictures taken with my iPad through the microscope by the students. And then what they did is they took their information, the things that they found with hands-on, tangible group work, and created some reports and some hypothesizing on what they think they could accomplish. This is Robert Garcia's 4th grade class, along with, I think, 3 other classes and a handful of parents who came to view the game app fair. Robert's students were using a classroom set of iPads that were lent to them, and they were basically out of the secondary iPad kind of repair rotation of iPads. So he used this classroom set for a few weeks. And his students created games. So they did the coding to create the games, and then they had a persuasive element where they had to write at least 3 persuasion points for why people should play their game. At the start of the game fair, each student and each adult received tickets to play the games, and students set prices for how many tickets, and tried to lure you, basically, to play their games. And, all of the games had long lines, so I couldn't fulfill my role of going to the ones that had no lines. They all had lines, which I was happy to see. And the kids were proud. You know, they had their trifold boards that told about their game, they told about their design, they told about why you play their game, and then at the end they did some economics work with who had the most tickets and some graphing and things that were appealing to people. So entrepreneurial spirit, that bottom middle picture is Isaac Lear, who gave away candy if you played his game.
A more traditional entrepreneur.
Extrinsic motivation at its best. Are there questions or clarifications I can make for you?
Board members, are there questions? Margaret?
Going back to achievement, how sure are you that some of that decline in achievement is due to the technology? I think there could be other factors.
Yeah,
well,
I'm not sure at all.
for everything.
No, I'm not attributing cause. I'm saying there's correlation. I don't know what caused it.
Okay, all we know is that the grades went down and this is going on. But it could be due to many other factors.
Right. It could be many different things. There's so many variables that it would be hard to attribute grades, and grades are subjective,
Right.
to what caused them.
Right, because I'm thinking that during all those years, smartphones got better and more achievable, and all the kids had smartphones with them and might have been distracted by their own technology in their pocket. So I'm just thinking, you know, we can't necessarily attribute that to.
And like I was showing, there were points, there were outlier terms that were higher failure rates than the last year's 2013 to 14, which showed kind of a general trend.
Right.
And when we're talking about that data, again, we're talking about typically 1 to 2% of all of the grades given. So 6 or 7 grades per student, because it's every class is in there. And so there might be students that fall into one-letter grades. There clearly are students that fall into one-letter grade category 5 times. So it's not number of students, it's not percentage of students, it's percentage of all letter grades given, say 1 to 2%. The changes were typically, say, 0.5% in difference. So it's pretty small, yet there was a trend.
And I think really the reflection here is just simply that as Kim gathered data from the various feedback in terms of either survey or listening session, there was an attribution that, well, the reason that grades were down last year was because of the iPads. And I think part of her work was just trying to see, is that a reasonable conclusion or not? And I think the basic data is showing that there may be some up and down trends, but there really is no conclusive long-term trend data about the impact of the technology on achievement, at least as measured by grades.
And furthermore, the motivation for that was really that I had heard single data points, and I wanted to see where they corresponded to any long-term data points.
Other questions?
So you were talking about distractibility and then the English language learner have to then express some sort of responsibility to the monitoring, and that there's plans in place for next year to go forward to address that. I'm curious as to why you wouldn't try to address it in some way this year.
Yeah. I would say that we have had means of addressing that with parents or with teachers who have requested it. I had some teachers come to me and say, the distractibility is too high, and I said, well, we could take these students, we could put them in a group, we could set out this expectation that here's what we're seeing. We're seeing that you're not focused, you're not using your iPads the way that you should. We're going to put you in a group that's restricted and allow access out of that group based on certain criteria. That was not what they wanted. And then the next option was look at the ones that are struggling the most and set some individual restrictions on those iPads. That was also not what they wanted. So I looked at it and I thought, you know, our options are kind of a widespread or a group that's struggling or an individual basis. And those were not wanted for the reasons that we would single out a group of kids and for the reasons that if we did this individually, we would require an adult to individually work with the students on doing that. Now, we could close the App Store, but we don't have the management system in place this year to actually set up new iPads and have it work that kind of background app store that we've talked about, that we would push out apps and that a student goes to install an app from us and it in the background opens the app store, installs the app, closes it back down again. That's not in place right now. We have a different system, and they're paid systems, so we purchased one for this year. Looking to purchase a different one moving forward that would allow us that flexibility. We could still close the app store. We would need to figure out then reopening it for any students that set up a new iPad for any reason of damage or new students to the district. And then also, because closing the App Store doesn't actually take away any of the games that are already there, we would need to go individually to each of the iPads and erase all the games that are there. And so that, it's possible. It's not simple. And I think with best interests of students in mind, we are able to do that for students that demonstrate a need. I think the high school has, that's not that I think, I know the high school and middle school both have systems in place for students, for parents or teachers who request that sort of assistance too.
Board members, other questions?
Kim, can you talk about the cost of the new system that has the ability to create a shadow app that we control?
Yeah, it's about, well, and it depends on how we move forward with our lease and such. It is a per student cost of about $5 a head, which is very similar to what we pay right now for our light speed management system. We would be moving to a system called Casper. That also provides the classroom management piece of teachers being able to lock students into an app for a time being during their course.
Is that an annual fee?
It is an annual fee.
And has been the previous piece was, I think it was $4 a student. And in the beginning, that system gave us exactly what we wanted, and then as things have changed, that company just has, I think it's fair to say, just has not kept pace, and they haven't had some of these more innovative approaches, such as hiding the App Store, but still allowing things to be pushed and installed. And I think the other key pieces too, that last year I think we probably had a couple of dozen between parents and the administration, the offices request us to do individual, restrictions. I worked with a number of parents, who didn't want to do the individual restrictions, themselves at home. Who I did that for them, and worked closely with them. So, that individual restriction piece is something that we've got directions on. We've, talked with people about it, and that's an approach we can still use, for this year moving forward. But I think as Kim has articulated, our original intent was empowerment. But we've learned some things, and we think there needs to be a different approach, and now we have some tools that provide even greater flexibility as we move forward. So it is a piece where we have some of those tools now. Engaging some of those tools now could create some potential additional. I imagine a classroom of 7th graders, and a new student shows up at the middle school, and to install the old apps for them, they have to press and turn the App Store on. I can imagine a room full of 7th graders saying, "Hey guys, the App Store is on," and in terms of that kind of distraction too. So I just think Kim makes a good point that it's all or none right now, and very soon we have that piece that can be something that is quite a bit more nuanced. Is that fair to say?
That is fair. I think it's all or none, or the case by case.
Just have a follow-up. So that's a sort of technology solution, but the other piece of it was parents wanting sort of more guidance, and is that something that we have to wait on too, or?
No, I don't think so. I think we can start providing that now.
I think the initial ones we can provide that are pretty straightforward to do are more face-to-face, kinds of things. And this, we have offered a handful of things through Community Ed. We can continue to offer them through Community Ed, or just have. I always envision those things as being kind of ECFE for secondary parents. And as a building principal at the junior high, even before technology, we offered something once a month about parenting, in terms of junior high, because it's a tough deal. And unfortunately, our history is we didn't get a lot of people to come, but I think we need to open it for the people who need to come. One of the beauty of ECFE classes is they tend to be relatively small, and people are willing to, so that part we don't have to wait on. The thing that will take some time to develop or purchase are some of the online resources that we heard people asking us for. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to put our name on something and put it out there if it's not high quality. I feel relatively confident that between Kim and myself and others, we can certainly, and leveraging Aaron's group, we can certainly provide high quality face-to-face pieces. But as we all know, not all online tools are created equally. And if we put something out with our name on it, we want to make sure that it's of high quality.
But as another note on that, I think moving into classrooms too with support for teachers in how do I fall back on some resources to promote responsible use for the certain tasks that I'm doing. When we start to do online research and we have a set of tools available to look to say, hey, let's remind ourselves about these practices that we need to follow right now. Or when we start to notice distractibility in our classrooms, that we fall back on a set of tools that I'm happy to put together, but I can't get that. Like I say, I want that quality, like Matt says, in those elements. And I think we can put that together really nicely and provide some tools to be classroom support and teacher support and parent support. I also recently worked with I worked with 2 teachers at the high school this week for tech coaching as they're looking to integrate some more technology in their classrooms. And one of those teachers had done a project where they used an app that monitored how much time was spent on their devices. So students installed it on their phones and on their iPads, Android and iPhone, and monitored how much time they spent and then reflected on what they were doing. And so it told them each time that they had opened their device. Did you have a student experience?
I've used that before for myself.
So each time that they had opened their device and how long they had been active, and then the cumulative for the day. And so those kinds of practices where students go, have some awareness of what they're doing and how they're using their technology, that's a helpful practice. And when that's embedded into coursework, I think that we're moving in the right direction.
Any board members with further?
No.
I presume that the information we learned from the listening session is not unique to Northfield. And I would expect that there are other districts who are ahead of us by probably some 6 months or a year or more. What information can we glean from them that can be applicable to us? Or let me ask it a different way. Is there information that can be gleaned that can be applicable to us without reinventing the wheel?
Most certainly. And I think Matt and I do that pretty much constantly, that we are working with a group of our professional learning network that's online, that's throughout the state, that's across the nation, sharing ideas for resources. Think of digital citizenship and responsibility. There's a whole document that both of us have used, and it comes from Dave Eisenman in Minnetonka, and lots of resources, and trusted resources, because we know Dave, and ways that we've shared with others as well. You look towards Eden Prairie, conversation with Michelle Amon, their director of technology, and how are they monitoring the effectiveness of technology in their district, and they don't have a quantitative model either. We haven't found yet. Not yet.
There we go.
We have not found a quantitative model yet. I collaborate with my former colleagues from Farmington and say, what are you doing with this? How are you going to monitor this? How are you managing this? Recently talked to them about web filtering, saying, how do you monitor safe searches of images? And talked to some of their technology teams. So that is a constant, I would say, working together with other districts who are also navigating this and saying we need to provide tools for our students and access to technology that they will use and that is our world. People talk about preparing students for the world when they graduate, but we're here, and it's not just their world, it's our world, and so helping all of us to manage it is an important thing.
First, I'm a fan of the iPads. I think they're great. I think they can be a great tool, and as you said, they're part of the future. That being said, I am a fan also of closing the App Store completely. I don't know why we didn't do it right away, or didn't have the technology. But I feel like modern life is distracting enough for the teens, especially given what we know about their brain structures right now. But why would we, the educators, give them another thing to be distracted with? So my question would be, if we close the App Store completely, does that hobble the teacher's ability to bring in apps that could be useful in their classrooms?
Yes.
It does.
It's not impossible. We can get extra apps added.
Okay.
When a teacher would request one, it would most likely go to an entire grade level of students or an entire school of students. And so monitoring, a teacher wants 5 apps. Well, in our self-service little app store, basically students would go to an icon called self-service and see all of the things that we've pushed out, which might include some policies and might include steps for, say, updating to a new operating system, some informational things, but also apps would be there. And there's some organization there. You can put things into categories. But it is also something we would not want to completely overload with 100 apps that students would sift through to find. So there is some hindrance there. Is it hindering to the point of not being productive? I don't think so. But it's also something to explore and say, you know what, we want to try, we need to close it down. That's loud and clear that people want the App Store closed down.
So you can tell them about the beacon.
Oh, the beacon is cool.
This is just the kind of thing where it is accelerating at such a range because of some of the concerns that we have right here. And so this is one of those, I think, happy mediums.
Well, it's a very cool possibility. So there's a new technology called an iBeacon. It's not even expensive. It's $25. And it works with the management system that we're looking at going to. And what it does is it's location-based, it's proximity-based. And so you could set up an iBeacon in, say, the tech office or something of that nature where a student, or you could take it to a classroom. And when students are working with a teacher and they want to try an app, now I was a little hesitant on this one because we haven't tried this. We have some people have tried it and it has worked in some locations, but we don't have enough evidence to say this is going to be the silver bullet of it. But it has very great potential. You could go to a classroom and say they're going to be installing an app. That class period, other students probably wouldn't know. You show up, the kids open up the App Store, they get their app because the beacon can contain the policies that go onto the iPads in that proximity. So those students would say, all right, here we are with this little device. It's opened up your App Store right now. Go and get this app. And they install it, leave with the beacon. Their policies are back in place to the original.
Do you have time to go and add Madden football at the same time?
What was that?
Well, the beacon's in there, would they have time to
Do Madden
Yes.
go
football
and add a
too.
few
Yes,
other?
they would. They would. It would open up the App Store. I don't know if you can program it. You probably could actually program it to provide a specific app, but I haven't tried it yet, so I don't know.
And then we're also hearing just in the last week that there's some other potential changes at the App Store at Apple where they would now they made us all do this under 13 Apple ID thing, and now they're talking about not require, which is really going back to the way that, if you remember, we did it to begin with at middle school. And I just want one piece about why we chose to open the App Store for the senior high kids. I want to make sure we talk about that because I don't remember how many meetings we did, but we did quite a few meetings when we were planning this. And one of the things we posed that question to community folks and a whole bunch of people, and the idea was that we wanted to try to empower kids because yes, there are lots of kids who are downloading Madden football, but there are also lots of kids who are downloading the Texas Instruments calculator and some other things that are very valuable and useful. So the intent was, if we show students that flexibility, that we believed, and I still believe long term, that we can help them become responsible users of it. But we have enough feedback to this point that strategy has not worked, that it would just not be appropriate for us not to listen to that feedback. Long term, is that probably the best thing to teach our kids how to use that? Without a doubt. But we also have some other realities in our circumstances here that we just have to listen to because we want to turn the conversation from that discussion to teaching and learning. And if that's getting in our way, we have to make that switch.
I just had, I'm sorry, board members, any other questions?
I think you could just call that a privilege, and if it's overused, you call it a privilege.
And actually, that's what we've done. That's how we do it now on an individual basis. But we're hearing enough concern, Jeff, where I think it's hit the tipping point. we've actually had some creative ideas of people saying, could we lock them all down and then let them in, after they've shown some responsibility. That's something we're looking at, how would it be feasible to manage that part as well. But there's some other creative ideas of reversing the tables and those kinds of things. But I just thought it was important to clarify the original rationale.
And there was parent feedback that was supportive of allowing parents to opt into an open app store. The calculator is a really great example, because the calculator that kids have been downloading is a $40 app. And that, when we push out apps to students, we need to provide a license to that app. And a $40 graphing calculator is not something that we are going to provide to every student at this point in time. So pushing it out to that app store would say a student can go and get it, and there we pay $40 for that, and that's a pretty hefty sum of money for all of our students. And so a student that decides to get a tool like that, that's a great tool we want them to be able to get. And the App Store close would prevent that. But maybe we could find a way with the iBeacon, maybe we could find a way working with a parent to say, hey, come on in, we're going to take this restriction off of your student's iPad, or they call it, something of that nature. But it would require some individual monitoring to do that.
I had one question. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the presentation, because I think it's great to hear what was the result of the listening session. And I know we're going forward into April, where we'll have to make some decisions about going forward. So it's really nice to have these check-ins about how the process is going. So I appreciate that. One question I had in terms of what we might have learned from the listening sessions with staff is, what did we learn about how we communicated the district's expectations for the use of technology, and how do you see us communicating going forward in terms of expectation? Because it seems there was a little bit of a disconnect, and I know, I'm sure we all found that frustrating, I think.
Yeah, there was definitely a disconnect, and I think the more open communication we can have, the better. Because I think we noticed that some people felt, like I say, judged based on how their teaching abilities judged based on how they use an iPad. And none of us expect our teachers to adapt their practices to something that is brand new to them and know exactly how to use it. And none of us expect to judge our teachers based on something that doesn't work, and then you learn from that and you try again. The only way that we really can get better is if we allow ourselves those risks of saying, I'm going to try something new. Well, what if it doesn't work? And how can I make that better for the future? And so even just in conversations I've had through the listening sessions, through people stopping in the hall to say, oh, I didn't have a chance to go, but I wanted to say this. And some eye-openers of saying, as a teacher, I use one-to-one iPads, and I probably use them about 50% of the class time. And I heard 2 teachers say, oh my gosh, I think people would be shocked to hear that you didn't use them all the time. And we've had elementary teachers say, what's the expectation? It can't be used 100% of the time. And none of us would promote that, using it 100% of the time. And so some clarity in what the expectations are, some clarity in just communicating moving forward. I see it a bit of a fresh start, regardless of how the choices pan out, what the recommendations are. We have had some really good listening going on, I think. And that means it gives us an opportunity to respond. And now we know some things that were maybe harbored and not spoken for quite some time.
Yeah. Since I was the one who did most of the communicating initially, I think it's a time to be reflective. And I think everyone at this table knows the commitment that we have to open and transparent communication, and all of the face-to-face meetings we did, to start the process, and then even last year with additional listenings and those pieces. So as we reflect upon how things were communicated, it's very important to all of our communication moving forward to learn what were the things that were stated in a way that were taken by people in various different ways, and how can we ensure that communication is really becoming I always think of it as multiple modalities, that because we have access to so many different ways of communication, that people really start to adopt a way that they communicate in general. So thinking about how we can review the writing that we did, which was quite a bit, and the face-to-face, and the going to staff meetings and reviewing and saying, okay, when we talked about this, what were some things that maybe we said that were unintentionally frustrated people? What are the ways that we continue to build relationships so people feel very comfortable in sharing those thoughts early on and often, and also looking at how we framed the 4-year plan. You know, if you really think about how we all thought we were doing a great job when we framed the 4-year plan, thinking that it was a very doable thing. But in the end, I think that lockstep piece that we had, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't. In fact, it probably wasn't the best way to do it. I think we all thought it was pretty good at the time because it gave a clear ladder, and we used to look at it as a ladder, not a ladder, right? But we have learned in a few months. So my hope by just sharing this, since I was the one that did a lot of communicating on this up front, and Kim is really doing an excellent job of taking it forward, which is exactly what we wanted the Director of Technology to do. I've had some frank conversations with people, apologizing to them if they took something that we said or shared in a way that it wasn't intended. We continue to move forward, and we'll continue to learn as we always do from any time we have an opportunity to communicate. Is that helpful, Julie?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Okay, board members, will move on next to hearing some additional information and follow-up to the preliminary district master facilities plan that was initially presented at our last board meeting. Just want to remind board members there's information provided in the table file that will facilitate discussion. Dr. Richardson?
And what we wanted to try to do tonight is to kind of take you back for just a moment, talk about where we've been, talk about a couple of the issues that you identified and wanted us to provide you some information that we're able to give you right here, identify some additional information that we need to continue to work on before we bring a plan back to share with the community. And then also to talk to you a little bit about strategy for moving forward with community conversations and staff conversations about the plan. Again, I think if you look at this, I hope that the sense you have with this is very much in the same vein as the work we did with technology transformation. This is not a rush. We're not anxious to get this done tomorrow. But what we want to do is make sure that we've got a really solid plan to think about, that we address the variety of different issues that are there in the different buildings, and that when we go out to the community and to the staff to start talking about what do we really think should be done in the variety of buildings, that we've got some solid ground to stand on. Because it's going to be important in that next step of the process when we go to the community and back to you, to be able to come back to give you feedback about what's the community saying about the plan as we have it right now, and with whatever modifications we make before it goes out, so that you'll be closer to being ready to say, yes, we like these parts of the plan, or we like the entire plan, or really, Chris and Matt, this is not where we want to go and we want to back up or we want to stop. But we also know that when we take a look at the district, and we have buildings built in 1947, and we have other buildings built in the 60s and the 70s, that we have issues that we need to be thinking about addressing. You may have noticed that today the governor's new revised budget came out. And the revised budget is calling for universal 4-year-old programming for every student in the state. Significant increase in potential space needs if that's implemented. So I think we need to be thinking about not only what we need for tomorrow, but also what we need 10 and 20 years in the future. And my hope is that we can put together a plan that will really help you get there. And do it in the same kind of manner that we've done other pieces like this as far as stewardship of the community's dollars. Because this is a big deal. And we're not looking at just one building or part of one building. We're looking at all 6 of the facilities that we currently occupy in the district. So Matt's got basically a report to share with you in terms of the information that we have here. Then we'd kind of like, again, to open this piece up to say, tell us what else you're thinking. Are there other things that now you've had a couple weeks to cogitate over the work from last time? Are there other things that you're saying now, gee, I wish we'd asked about, or I wish we'd thought about, or have you considered, so that as we work with ATS&R to get the final version, the preliminary plan ready to go out to the community, that we have the data that we need to make that happen. Matt, you're
The
up.
final preliminary plan, I love it.
Final
Does it get any more tentative than that?
Plan.
Well, very
Sorta,
good. Dr. Richards,
sorta.
I'm happy that you gave it to me. Over the next 90 minutes, I plan to explore them. Just kidding.
Just
Actually, we've got a but I do think it's important anytime that we're talking about this in a public forum to quickly revisit the bullet points so that anyone who's new to the conversation has a idea of the road that we've been on. So just those 3 bullet points is that we started this, as you remember, when we were looking at the demographic study that we was prompted really by All Day K when we first got that. So that report was done by Hazel Reinhardt and provided to the board in June of 2014. At that same time, ATS&R, under the work of working with Paul Bell, Director of Buildings and Grounds, and our building principals, did an exhaustive report of deferred maintenance and educational adequacy at each of our facilities, and you heard that report in August of 2014. And then, as you recall, last fall, we had a series of 18 meetings over the course of October, meeting with parents and staff at each building, 1 meeting for staff, 1 meeting for parents at each facility that hosts district programs. That includes the NCRC. And then we had one of our best meetings with the District Youth Council, which was really great. They gave us some great feedback as well. So then, of course, as you know, at the last board meeting, the preliminary plan was presented by Mark Hayes of ATS&R. And we did have a few questions that resulted from that. So we just did a little work for you in the last couple of weeks here. The first question is really about when do our current bonds expire? And just really kind of providing that understanding of what debt do we have and when do we pay it off. And so what you'll see is that when we get this sheet from Val, it's got like 9 or 10 columns, and we simplified it to 4, really saying what was the issue date, what was the original issue, so how much did the district originally borrow, what was the purpose. Now the purpose gets a little muddy because you'll see that word refund in there, count it 4 times, right, 1, 2, 3, 4. The beauty of that is, as you know, being really focused on stewardship, anytime that our consultants say, this is a positive time for you to refund or basically renegotiate the interest on this where we can save some money, we do so. So sometimes some of those previous bond issues get intermelded together depending on how they helped us do those refunding. So it's not like you can say, oh, this is completely the middle school or this is completely Bridgewater anymore. And then you'll see in the final column, it's the final maturity date. So basically we have some coming off the books, some smaller ones in 16 and 17, and one of those was a roof issue, and as you all know, last year we went right back out and did some additional roofs because that's an ongoing project, and if you don't keep up with roofs, you will be keeping up with roofs unplanned because that's how those things work. Mr. Bell has no experience with that. So then what we see is then we have another series in 2022 and 2024, and then a couple of additional ones in 2025. So remember, we talked about this as a long-term facilities plan. So we just think this information for you as to when those current bonds expire is important for your knowledge as we have this discussion. The second question Noel raised really about how much it costs per square foot to operate our current facilities. And what we're showing here is energy costs. And as we've told you before, Longfellow, I think ironically the oldest building, is the most efficient to operate it, but again, it is the only building that is fallout shelter, so that might have something to do with it.
certified.
Yeah. And what we want to point out, and if people have questions about this, I've asked Paul to be here tonight. There's one thing that's a number that you look at and you say, wow, our newest building, you know, the middle school tends to be the most expensive to operate. And when you look at that, it's actually even when, and it's hard to compare our middle school to other middle schools. We use some tools from the state called the B3 Energy Efficiency Benchmarking Program. But if you really think about our middle school is a middle school that has some amenities that typically are found at high schools. And we have 2 major pieces of pool. Even in this benchmarking system, we are able to check that we have a pool, you know, so it takes that into account. But we also have that beautiful 800-seat auditorium that we have sold out 6 times for that wonderful rock and roll revival show. But when you have a room that large, there's an energy efficiency issue there. We all know that. And so Mr. Bell has been really diligent about looking at the controls and the systems in that building and seeing are there additional, you'll see there's that energy cost is down 9% from the baseline year. And I know Paul is in some deep discussions with one of the original vendors for some of the equipment that governs the pool area in terms of some things where Paul really feels it could be much more efficient than it is now, and just some pieces that need to be looked at. And so it's an outfit out of Georgia, I believe, Paul? So just pointing out that we're continuing to look at, do we have that middle school operating at maximum efficiency? And I think Paul would tell us probably some room for growth. Okay. And then just the last two pieces that we included were the concept around just letting you know with the Longfellow and Greenville Park what that interdependent plan that envisions the current Greenville Park Elementary becoming an early childhood center with a new elementary school on that same site. One piece, if you noticed in the fine print of the report, you saw a daycare facility in both Longfellow and at Greenville Park, and frankly, it was because we had not really been able to fully understand how would we do daycare for the students at the ALC. As you know, one of the reasons that the daycare is in the place that it is it was originally intended to help serve students in the ALC. And in additional discussions with Aaron, we've looked at that it would actually even, we think most students who need access to those spots that are part of the daycare for the ALC have transportation to where they could get their children to Greenville Park. It is not, of course, it's not all that far. And Aaron's calculations even show it would be cheaper for us to run transportation from Longfellow to Greenville Park than keeping a daycare at both sites. So what we envision the next round of the preliminary plan would be saying that the daycare would be at that repurposed Greenville Park facility. That would open up some additional rooms in the basement of Longfellow, for additional district office space, or even we have very little place in this district for storage. And even if some of those rooms that are on the lower basement level were storage, that would be a huge asset to the district. Nobody wants to build storage, but we have a place where we potentially could use it for that. Then the second piece is that, Noel, you had asked too about looking at what part, if we were to go look at the interdependent plan for Northfield High School, and were to consider building a new multi-story building on this same site, would there be a possibility of doing some, saving some of this building, moving forward? And that's just a piece we have not gotten quite through yet, because it's really looking about what are the parts of the building that would make sense to keep, and where do they land on the footprint with the attempt to reclaim green space in order to have the fields. That's a piece we're just continuing looking at and trying to determine what would be the best piece. It's more than just where does the exterior wall end in some cases. It's about where the boilers are and some of those kinds of pieces. But we also think we've actually been doing some brainstorming. There's some pretty exciting opportunities should that be something that could work out in terms of that. But we also know these are the first two of what I'm going to guess are going to be many tweaks or revisions to these particular approaches, because these are very tentative plans. They're simply the next step in what we envision to be a longer discussion. And to that end of a longer discussion, we would offer some potential next steps. If you think about what our original timeline was, we're just a little bit behind is not the right word, but we thought we might be in March able to talk with people about the plan. It's going to be April, because we know in a week or so we've got spring break, and people are going to be thinking about that. But what we plan to do is come back in April and do a very similar tour. This time we're going to sell T-shirts, okay, at all the facilities. But Chris and I and Paul would plan to do another tour of each building, both with staff and with community. We'd plan to come back to the District Youth Council because they gave us some really great feedback on the first part, but just to share with them these concepts and very much keep them in that concepts or approaches that we're considering. What do you think? And that would be what we believe our next step would be, followed by me discussing that further during the summer months, and then trying, our anticipation, probably late summer, early fall, maybe being able to have a point of really having a master facilities plan that wouldn't be preliminary in place. So those are just a handful of pieces we wanted to share and talk about. Dr. Richardson, did I miss anything?
I think only that as we pulled the two pieces out in terms of Longfellow and Northfield High School, we did have a chance to meet with Cabinet. Basically took a look at this and several other pieces that they said, the more we've thought about it, the more we think there may be some other tweaks that would make some sense here. And I guess what we want to be able to do is to work those through with ATS&R to say how much do those make sense and can they work. We also heard very clearly with Longfellow that one of the advantages of maintaining the bottom floor as space in the district office is that we might actually create a large group presentation room and a boardroom in that basement level, and then maintain the existing gymnasium for the ALC, so that they would continue to have a space, and I think that makes some good sense. And I think it was very clear from Aaron and Sarah that their sense is, again, moving the entire early childhood piece there makes sense. Aaron and Sarah also did some other work in terms of doing some thinking about the existing Greenville Park building and the other things that would need to be in place, and actually pulled out some data from Fire Marshal's previous visits and some other things where we've used that at various summers. So there's some other things that we're going to need to take a look at, especially in identifying which classrooms might be appropriate for that birth to 2.5-year-old children versus those rooms that are going to be appropriate for 3- and 4-year-olds. But I think all of that, I think we'll be able to kind of get ahead of that process in terms of kind of thinking about what needs to happen there to make it work well. And as Matt said, I think there are lots of different ways to skin the Northfield High School existing building to say, are there some pieces there that make sense to keep?
Might talk about puzzle pieces.
And it really is puzzle pieces, but it's not only the pieces of the building, but it's also how does the current building sit on the site and how much room does it take up? Because remember, again, one of the issues with this building is the fact that it was built in the California style. So everything is on one floor. Every room has an outside window. You got double loaded corridors, so you have this maze of different classroom spaces that spread out. So part of the question would be, if we took down part of the building, what pieces might we keep? We already know that there would be some issues around, some positives around maintaining gym space, maintaining the smaller auditorium space, which is fairly new property, the lower cafeteria, and maybe even taking a look at, are there other things that ought to be on this site that might be other recreational, interscholastic, other kinds of activity spaces that could be done here. At the same time, we also have to work with the idea that we have to remember where is the boiler system. And so if you're going to keep a piece of the building, either you're going to have to move the boiler to where the remaining building is, or you're going to have to keep enough of the building to maintain the boiler. So there are lots of questions that we still need to answer about that piece. But we want to try to have that thought through before we go out to the community so that they can see what might be some of the possibilities as far as that direction. The flip side is we know that there are some real positives about locating the new building on this site. Think back to when we talked about the Y and talked about the possibility of locating the Y on this site and how protective people were in terms of wanting to make sure that this site remained school district property, and because of people seeing it as centrally located in the community. So, I think there are some real potentials of doing the project that we were talking about here, because it will add to that. There were a list of at least 5 or 6 other things that cabinet folks.
Well, and I think this is a great example of just, even after we have had all these other discussions, we already have a handful. And really that's what, if you think about the process we intend, even though we saw some schematics the last time, those aren't architectural schematics, they're concept drawings. And so what we're hearing now is what we think is the appropriate next step. We're going to share some thoughts and some concepts and some ideas. Let's hear what people's reactions, because exactly some of these kinds of pieces, it's that one, we were very careful not to assume what people wanted. In terms of this, we've tried to approach this from a very 30,000-foot level, but with enough detail that people can look at, oh, yes, that concept, makes some sense. Now let's dig into it a little bit deeper. I expect that by the time we're done, we're going to have 5, 6, 8, maybe 10 times that list of, well, have you thought about this part of that? Because that's how the discussion was intended to boil to the top. At least that was my understanding of what our charge was. And I think that that's exactly where we're at. We're not going to be to the top yet. We're about in the middle. That's where I see us.
So I think the thing we're really looking for this evening is
Just to add to the list.
to add to the list. So if there are other pieces that, as you have percolated on this over the last couple of weeks, are there other things that you're coming back to us already and saying, gee, I really thought about this, and I really would like you to think about this other piece at Sydney, or this other piece at, in terms of the new Greenville Park option, or even the existing Greenville Park option? Are there things that you'd like to see done differently at Bridgewater? So that again, we have as many things to kind of put together and have out there as we possibly can, and that we have as few things that people are going to come back and say, well, I've been thinking about this for 6 months, and it's not in the things that you're sharing with me now. I'd like to try to get those out on the table so that we can begin looking. And I know Matt will be taking copious notes.
You bet.
Board members? Jeff?
One example, I guess, I was going to ask the question to Chris because he's been around a while, with buildings. As far as, when you put a building up, I mean, what do you 50 years, a good time, it's kind of like the car analogy. I mean, how, best practices and cost and what you expect to get back out of it. I just look at this list and I just find it kind of, ironic. Again, I did go to Longfellow, and it's our oldest building and it's our most efficient too. So it's kind of like, yeah, you could build a tank for it to fit, but, when I look at whatever we're doing, for the high school site here, it's going to be like our 50-year plan. I mean, it's going to be a big deal. So I'm just wondering, can you have anything with all the districts and stuff that you've worked with?
My sense is, most buildings are designed to last at least 50 years. What I know and what we talked about previously was the idea that depending on the choices that the board makes over the course of the next year, you will either extend the life of an existing building with good things and bad things, or you will make a choice to go to a different structure, a different approach. And I think that's one of the big things that you're going to be really tasked as a board with trying to do, is to determine what's the right strategy for the various pieces. If you think about the history here in Northfield, we had a building that up until 11 years ago was built in 1912, 1910.
Can't help it,
Even no, but it basically was serving a purpose, but it wasn't doing a good job. And if you think of the amount of dollars that Carlton spent to renovate and maintain that portion, I mean, it was a great service to the community because people wanted to keep the historical heritage of the community, but no school district would ever be able to come in and do the kind of renovation that they had done. And so there are, I think, I would say that as you're looking at most of our buildings, if you think about the buildings that you focus on, you're going to focus either on buildings that, because of their nature, have not worked the way they should, or buildings that are reaching a useful end to their life, or buildings that are going to need a significant repurpose in order to work. Now, the interesting piece with like Longfellow is, I think that the students and staff really like the upstairs. That's their building. And I think while it isn't really a good building for many of the things that you want to do with early childhood or elementary anymore, it works perfectly well for an ALC upstairs, and it could work to provide office space the district, which then opens up other spaces to do other things with. So, you notice how well I danced around that answer? Probably, you know, you're looking at 50 years plus, but you also have to look at, is the building meeting our needs? And it may be that just in the design or the structure or the way it's put together, it isn't doing what we need to do, and it might work better in a repurposed format.
I should know this, but where is the boiler in this building?
That way. It's right next to the, it's in the B wing. I think it's in the B wing, but then there's an open space where there's a dock area.
A loading dock that
Before you get over
to the
auditorium.
loading dock, and it comes around with the shops. So you come to corridors are there, the art room is over here, the art suite, and then here's the boiler room. So when you come out, you're right there by the dumpsters in the back there, the electrical room and the boiler room. So it's sort of.
So at least it's not over there, Jeff, but it's in the middle of the building.
So quick question, at a minimum, if one, you know, there's other ideas there, but if one kept the gym and the auditorium, would you need to move the boiler?
We have tunnels under there. I mean, there's tunnels, most of the piping is there. It's, so you'd probably be fine. The problem with the gymnasium area is just the different levels. So that's always a challenge, because that's one of the things that makes it so ineffective now. There's no handicap accessibility in those areas. So how do you fix that? Now would be what we have to think. If you try to save an area, does it work? Because like Longfellow basically works. It just was classrooms and offices, and so we've been able to repurpose it. But here they just kept building at all these different elevations with ramps and stairs, and we've added an elevator, but you know, the architect said you probably need another one if you did any work. And so that's where it's just a chopped up building, and then not all the areas have tunnels, and so trying to make sure. And then the older areas, I'm guessing we'd have to do abatement in the tunnels if we started cutting things up. And so it brings up a lot of issues. Not saying it can't be done, but it just, you're trying, I don't know how much it'd save, but,
Right.
you know, but the boiler is there. I mean, so all the areas around it are all fairly close, and everything goes there. The chillers would be probably all the water that runs to all the units. Depending on where you cut it off, you have all those lines, water lines, sewer lines, and all that.
So there's one argument for keeping something, there's definitely a good one for tearing it all down and starting over.
Yeah, so it'd be a lot of work to looking at to make sure that when you cut the section off, you don't want that the infrastructure is still there to maintain what's left.
Board members, other questions? Rob?
Well, one of the things I really like about, I mean, I like having these three buildings, the high school, Bridgewater, and the middle school. It creates kind of like a campus feel. But what it does that's a kind of negative thing is the traffic situation, especially at two different times of the day. And if you have an early childhood center and the new Greenville right next to each other, I'm just wondering about the impact of Lincoln Parkway, and you know, whether there's a way to also do a kind of traffic study as part of this, because you're increasing the traffic there if you go that route.
And I think that's something that we would need to look at as we go forward, because you're right, you are increasing the number of students and parents, and basically with the age of the kids in the early childhood building, all of those kids are either going to come on a bus or their parents are going to bring them. Nobody's walking.
We do have some more staggered timing, though. I mean, like, if you think about early ventures, some drop off as early as 6, you know, a lot of the drop offs happen between 6:30 and 8 a.m. Right now, our preschool.
Oh!
Oh my gosh.
I like the wall.
I'm glad that happened tonight, not during
Yep.
school.
I'll try to keep going.
Keep going, Aaron.
Our morning preschool is, right now, it's been 8:45 to 11:45. Now, obviously, that could change. And then our afternoon preschool is 12:45 to 3:45. And then early ventures pickups again happen near the end of the day. So there is a little bit of staggered start and pickups in that schedule.
What happened down there?
There's a, if you notice above the bookshelves in the back there are some pictures that are up on top of those bookshelves. And apparently the cooling system here must have blown away just right that one of them fell down, but I'm happy it happened tonight, not during the day.
Could you delay the demolition?
This is an indication of we're moving fast on this.
Guys, tell them to get a move on.
And
Yes, no problem.
then if you're moving that daycare from Longfellow to the new, the old Greenville, there were some parts of, I think, the original plan, like moving the buses off the street at Longfellow. I think that was one of the parts of it, and there's a playground there that you wouldn't need. So, I mean, how much does it change what the plan for Longfellow was, other than the basement?
In some ways, it would actually reduce costs because we wouldn't be replacing playground equipment on that site. We would probably be adding age-appropriate playground equipment. But the issue is some of the playground equipment at Longfellow is at the end of its useful life, needs to go away. As far as the pull-in, you still have activities that would be occurring that would require buses to cut in off the street. That's going to move much quicker than anything we're going to be able to do anyway, because all that work will be done by the end of next summer. And actually moving light poles within the next 2 or 3 weeks, so that they can be prepared to do the bus cut in on the street and do that piece. So it's one of those things where while we can do everything we can, there may be some things that the city is just going to do before we have a chance to say, oh, we probably don't need that anymore. And I think even then with the ALC, there would still be some bus traffic.
Within the NHS campus, is there something that's non-negotiable as far as green spaces and what we need for fields as a minimum, or then optional, or could you even extend and go up around the middle school for shared use or other?
To say, I suppose that at this point, the only thing that I've heard so far that was, I'm not going to use the term non-negotiable because I do believe that there's open to discussion about a lot of things. We've heard a lot of piece around keeping Memorial Field where it is.
Yeah,
That's a piece that, while I would say it's non-negotiable, I would say that's about as close as we have in terms of green space.
That should be a no-brainer.
But in terms of, it's about trying to make sure that we can at least replicate the green space and the activity fields that we have on this site. And certainly would be open to potentially looking at, which we already use many of the fields over by the middle school. But there certainly could be some additional discussions around what kinds of activities, and if there needed to be a plan to do some, depending on what we were to do at this site, if there needed to be some kind of coinciding upgrading of a particular green space near the middle school to leverage that as a higher level playing space rather than just a practice or those kinds of things. I think that certainly can be something that is discussed. Because we're at the approach level right now. The approach level is really about if there's something that makes sense, this is the time to look at it.
Because the other thing, at least in terms of the initial discussion, is if you move it from a field to a turf to field,
Right.
you now change the complexion in terms of how many sports can use that, how many seasons it can be used, how often it can be used, to where that I think will change the practice needs as we go forward. It's not going to eliminate the need for additional practice fields, but it will change how much can be done on the field versus how much has to be done in practice areas to keep the field pristine.
Board members, other questions? Oh, I have a couple. In terms of the,
During my
oh, is it on? in terms of the new Greenvale Park and the situation there, so one question I had was looking at the enrollment numbers at all of the 3 elementaries and realizing that if we did build any new elementary, we would be hitting where we're starting to see a dip in the K-5 enrollment. So it seems like I wasn't sure how that factored into a facilities plan if we knew we were going to have to look at sort of balancing enrollments, and then whether some of the pieces on Sibley and Bridgewater would still be needed when we're looking at dips in enrollment and building a 600 student facility. So that was, I guess, one question is how does that fit into, I mean, is it something that we need to factor into before we would approve a facilities plan?
I think in terms of Bridgewater and Sibley, the proposals, if you really think about them, the proposal for Sibley adds basically fine arts space and media center space to allow the cafeteria to grow to something more realistic for a building of 500. Again, with the idea that the original cafeteria and the original music space was for building 300 and some kids. So my sense is that what we're talking about doing with Sibley, again, does not add any classrooms, and in fact eliminates one of the existing computer labs because that becomes the entryway into the new media center. If we look at Bridgewater, again, if you look at that, the work that's going to be done moves all of the office out into the fronts to get what we need to do there for security and getting all of those office spaces on the front side of the building as opposed to in the center of the building. And really, if you look at what's going to go into those spaces, it really is all things that currently right now are either teachers in shared rooms, teachers in partial office spaces, teachers in storage closets. And so again, in terms of adding spaces back, it does not do much good for that. So then I think that the question as we go forward, and the other question that as a board you're going to have to work through is, do you want to make significant changes in the way you have handled the boundary policy in the district? Because, in order to make modifications, you actually would have to redraw the boundary. And not only would you redraw the boundary, but you'd have to do a couple things that politically are not going to be very comfortable. Things like, do we eliminate daycare as being an automatic ability for you to go to a certain building that's in the attendance area? Looking at pretty much reducing or eliminating intra-district transfers. It's still not, however, a huge number of kids. I think we did the calculations, and I think even with ebb and flow of kids, I think it's like we lose like 39 students from Greenville Park, and we gain about 12 at Sibley and about 25 at Bridgewater. So you're not, and if you think about spreading that across 6 grades, it's not a whole lot of kids. The other piece we have, though, that is an impact is the open enrollment process, which, we do see the significant majority of students who come into our district right now through open enrollment go to Bridgewater because it is the closest building to where their home school district is. And remembering that as you do that you may or may not have people who are willing to continue to open enroll if they don't go into the building they see as being the most convenient. They have the opportunity to go to any other building or district that they want to try to address that. So that would be a tougher discussion. The other piece that we could take a look at would be in terms of thinking about if we end up with a universal 4-year-old program, maybe you create a building that houses the entire kindergarten for the district, along with 1 through 5 of the rest of the grades, and you push then 1 through 5 back to their home school when they did kindergarten. So you could get all of the advantages of intermingling the preschool programming and the kindergarten programming on the same site. Now you're really starting to stretch discussion, but I think it's things we have to think and talk about, because that's the piece. Otherwise, because what I'm hearing you say, Ellen, is really, otherwise, why would we build a building for more than 500 kids if we're never going to have more than 500 kids in the building? And how much money could we save if we do that? What we also know, though, is that sometimes a building built for 500, depending on how many special education programs in it, ends up having a number of those rooms disappear because they're used to house a small number of kids who need a bigger space. And I think we're going to continue as a district to continue to see the growth in high-need special education students who require larger spaces, fewer students, but in a full-size classroom. So I think there's a couple different ways we can go at that. And I think, operating with the idea of a 600-student building, with the fact that Bridgewater, since I've been here, has been over 600. Sibley has been very close to 600, during the time I've been here. It's unreasonable to look at creating 3 buildings that are very equivalent in size.
Yes, sure.
And that is more information as a board member, which would be helpful. Is right now at the high school we have kind of almost an all or nothing. It's a home high school or some smaller, more in the arts in the office sort of space. And in terms of being able to talk about why we might want to hold the building, I've been just informally sharing what we've learned so far as people have asked. But it's getting a better understanding of how to explain what we mean by education adequacy and why a building is no longer educationally adequate. So I think that doesn't have to be a discussion tonight. That would just help as a board member as we go forward, particularly if we're looking at the high school being sort of an all or nothing thing, to talk about the all, which is sort of new building. I feel like I'm not on solid ground to talk about that yet.
No, I think that's very appropriate to talk about what would you get in a new building that is difficult to get here, even spending 3 or 4 times what we're proposing in the renovation project. And I think you hit the other piece right on the head. Is right now the renovation project is very limited fixes in only certain areas of the building, and really, except for the orchestra band area, touches not a single classroom in the building. With some classrooms being in pretty good shape because they're newer additions, and some being 1963.
Margaret, first what I understood is that the additions we were talking about, if we kept a building, is like at rock bottom, this is what we need to do. I mean, that altering a building can swell a little bit as opposed to building a new building. When I look at these, the one that jumps out at me as being absolutely so smart that it's ridiculous really is the Greenville Park transformation, transferring that to an early childhood and building a new Greenville Park. That really just jumps at me as an excellent idea. And then I also, because I'm going back to when you're saying, what have we not considered? I've been hearing from a lot of high school kids. They're not necessarily a representative sample, but they know me. And they've been talking to me, and they love this building. They really love this building, and they don't want to build a new building. But what I'm hearing from them all loud and clear is, just give us AC in the fall and the spring, and we're good. So the high school kids really just want to see some tweaks, and they want to keep the building. Also, I'm going to make sure that if we are talking about any new building, whether it be the high school or Greenville Park, that we really look at the boundaries and make sure that we don't landlock ourselves. Like when I look at where the proposed space for a new high school would be, we've got a road, and Memorial Field. And we can't, demographics show us some projections, but they're merely projections. We don't know what would happen. And what I'd like to see is if we're going to invest in a building, that it's got room for good additions for the next generation or 2 generations down the road. That we don't, or that if it's a 1-level building, that we make sure it's got the structure that a second story can be added, and 20 years, 15 years, something, so that we don't bind up the future. So those are just my addition.
And again, just to be clear with the high school, the recommendation there is a two-story building.
Yeah.
Almost all new high schools now are two-story buildings, at least.
Right.
And, all of the issues before of creating them as one story spread out, California style. Again, that's a 60s, 70s strategy from another century and another millennium.
And it uses a lot of land.
Yes, and eats up a chunk of land.
I was reading through the report and regarding the operating cost per foot. And it may be that we should add a footnote that identifies the Northfield Middle School having a high operating cost for these various reasons. There is something unique about it, and maybe they could be put in perspective to other schools that are comparable with an auditorium, with a swimming pool, and all the rest of it. But I think I was really surprised to find that the most recent school is the most expensive operating dollars, thinking about what's in there. And the inefficiencies of keeping a swimming pool space heated when it has no particular use except for that purpose. And same as some other things. And, thanks for the help. Thanks for
Just a little more explanation, articulating that these are some possible reasons why this building costs more to operate than what you might think of as a typical middle
Well,
school.
my thought is the public going to look at this and say, wow, we just built a new school, it's the newest building, and it's the most expensive to operate. Did we get our money's worth? I don't want to have that conversation.
Understand.
So a little bit of footnote preceding it might derail that conversation in the right direction.
Board members, any other questions or comments? I had one question. As we move forward with community input in those meetings, I know currently on the district master facility planning link that we have on the district website, you have downloaded the board meeting from February 23rd. And I'm wondering, at some point, would this document, in terms of being able to, is it somewhat unwieldy?
It's on the site already, actually.
It's on there.
Well, when I went on, all I saw was the board meeting, so I apologize. I know we played the whole board meeting, but I didn't realize that plan was on.
Yeah, there's a link, I think it's at the top where we described it. I think it's the link that talks about they presented this plan, and that should be a link. I'll go back to check to make sure it didn't do something
And it
funky.
could be
but
just me, because when I tried to link, it went right to the school board meeting only, so that would be good.
we'll take a look at it, Julie, to make sure, because our intent was to put in transparency, we need to put the whole plan out there. So that's what we try to do, but it's possible I clicked the wrong button, so I'll just verify.
Okay, thank you. So then I think this was a great presentation in terms of being able to, have benchmarks and the way as we move forward. When do you envision that you would come back with a scheduled meetings? I know it's always very difficult to try to get those scheduled around myriad of other things.
I think your intent would be, once we get the pieces we need from ATS&R, then, trying to move directly into doing those pieces. So I want to hedge a little bit that it could be either the first or the second meeting in April. We really like to do the first meeting in April because as much as possible, we'd like to get as many of these meetings done.
Well, what we really found to be successful,
Before the end of May.
I think what we found really successful the last time was to try to partner the elementary meetings as to the best of our ability with the PTO meetings, typically doing it before and after, because we knew we had a group of parents coming already. So we'd like to explore that with our elementary principals again, if that would be something that would work. Because it did work relatively well the last time. We had some bigger groups there. And then you remember we tried to partner some of the stuff with, parent-teacher conferences at the high school in the fall. And that, we had some people, but not nearly as many as the career counselor who, boy, he had a packed room.
I was going to say, he wowed him.
But I'm not sure, do you have a PTO meeting in May? Okay, all right, because I just want to make sure we don't miss a PTO meeting either if somebody has one early in April.
And again, what we wanted is before we went back to ATSNR, we wanted to make sure there were no lightning strikes around this table as far as things that you'd say, why did you think about that? We don't want to put ahead of the 8 kind of thing. We need to know those pieces. So we really appreciate the information, but I think that's, again, helps inform us of the other things that we need to nail down, and we'll get with Marquez to determine what else we need to create before we get ready to go back out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll move forward. There are no items for individual action this evening, so we'll move on to approval of the consent grouping. And as a reminder, there were a number of personnel items in the table file that were to be added to the consent grouping. Is there anything anyone would like to pull from the consent grouping? Is there a motion to approve the consent grouping? Moved by Ann, second? Second by Ellen. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the consent grouping, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Items for information. Dr. Richardson, there are 2 items this evening. One was detailed on the table file.
Right, and obviously the first one, again, your enrollment report. I keep looking to come up with some really exciting news for you, but as you look at the numbers, you go back to September 2nd, when we had 3,941.5 students on September 2nd, and March 1st, we had 3,941.5 students. So, I don't want to say flat, but it's as flat as it can possibly be. So, but that's also a good thing. We're not really seeing losses in terms of student population. You always have some variation over the course of months. We're pretty much keeping a nice solid number right under 4,000 students. So that's really is kind of what there is to tell you about. Again, the other part of that enrollment report again shows you the class size numbers, and again the fact that we've been able to keep, I think, a very reasonable class size, especially in primary grades as we go forward, despite the fact that our secondary numbers continue to be high. The other item that, again, it was in the table file is just the announcement of this closed negotiation strategy session. So we'd like you to make sure that you mark your calendars so that on April 13th, and after the end of the board meeting on that date, that we will have a closed negotiation strategy session. And obviously, we're beginning the process of discussing our negotiations with the Northfield Education Association and preparing information for you to begin to do some thinking about that process. At the same time, we also are very understanding of the fact that it's almost impossible to anticipate that the state is going to be done with their budgeting process. I don't expect that until potentially the last day or so of the session. And obviously, as I've shared with you guys before, I'm concerned that while we have the governor's focus in terms of early childhood, which nobody's denying is an important component, the concept of all of the new dollars moving in that direction and leaving 1% per year, when even to get to inflation you need at least 1.8 to 2% per year just to keep the formula paying what it has before in terms of its ability to fund programming. If that goes forward, as you know, we're looking at a very different situation over the course of the next 2 years. For next year, things change, but definitely. So that part, we just have to wait and see how that's going. We're hearing very different things from the legislators than we are from the governor's office. The governor does not seem to be budging. So we just have to see how that plays out as we go forward over the next month and 2 months.
Reminder of future meetings, Monday, April 13th, and Monday, April 27th. With that, I ask for a motion that we adjourn. Moved by Noel, second. Second by Ellen. All those in favor, say aye. Opposed? We are adjourned.